I'm Jane Mitchell, 34 years old, and if you told me a year ago that I'd be at the center of a corporate scandal, I would have laughed. That night in December started like any other holiday party in New York. All twinkling lights and polished glass, the air warm with chatter, and the smell of champagne. The ballroom of the hotel was crowded with people in their best suits and dresses, small clusters of conversation flowing around tall tables covered in crisp white cloth. I was standing near the dessert table, listening to a colleague tell a story about her kids, when my boss, Richard Cole, stepped up beside me. His face was red, not from the wine in his glass, but from something sharper. He didn't lower his voice. The words came out like a slap across the room. "You're worthless, a waste of company resources." The laughter and clinking glasses around us went silent. I could feel 50 pairs of eyes turning toward me, their curiosity mixing with the awkward discomfort that makes people freeze. My hand tightened on the stem of my champagne flute. For a moment, I thought about putting it down, about walking away before he could say more, but my feet didn't move. Richard kept going, his voice rising as if the room wasn't already focused on him. He listed my supposed failings, from ideas he claimed had no merit to projects he said I'd ruined. Every sentence was like a blade, meant to strip away whatever dignity I had left. My ears rang the golden string lights above, blurring into streaks. All I could see clearly was his mouth, the little spray of spit when he leaned closer to add another insult. This wasn't the first time he'd tried to humiliate me, but it was the first time he'd chosen such a public stage. He paused only when his wife, standing nearby in a pale blue dress, reached out to touch his arm. "Honey, maybe," she began, but I didn't let her finish. I turned my eyes to him, my voice steady in a way I hadn't expected. "That's not what the board told me when they made me your new boss yesterday." The room seemed to inhale at once. Richard's mouth stayed open, but no sound came out. A single drop of champagne slipped from the rim of his glass and hit the toe of his polished shoe. Conversations erupted in whispers, the words bouncing off the high ceiling like startled birds. Across the table, his wife's eyes widened. She pulled her hand back, as if she'd just realized she was holding on to something burning. Richard's face shifted from disbelief to something darker, the calculation of a man trying to regain control of a moment already lost. He searched the crowd looking for someone to back him up, but found only wide-eyed stares and the occasional smirk from those who had been on the receiving end of his arrogance before. I took a slow sip of my champagne, the bubbles sharp on my tongue. Somewhere near the back, someone laughed, a short burst quickly smothered, but it was enough to break the brittle silence. His wife looked between us, her gaze lingering on me with a kind of dawning recognition, as if she'd just connected something she'd overheard with the truth standing in front of her. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, but I didn't let it rush me. The more he floundered, the calmer I felt. Richard finally found his voice. There must be a mistake. I tilted my head slightly, letting the pause stretch before answering. The mistake was thinking nobody would notice. His jaw tightened. I could almost see the thoughts running behind his eyes, the scramble to reframe this in his favor. But the power had shifted in those few seconds, and everyone in the room could feel it. I didn't say anything more. I didn't need to. The truth had landed, and it was heavier than anything he'd thrown at me. My mind flicked back to the phone call I'd received the morning before, the one that had changed everything, though I'd kept it to myself until now. I hadn't planned to reveal it like this, but sometimes the right moment finds you whether you're ready or not. The hotel's pianist kept his hands poised above the keys, clearly unsure if the music should resume. No one moved toward the dance floor. In that pocket of stunned quiet, I finished my champagne and set the empty glass down on the nearest table. I gave Richard a small, polite nod, the kind you give someone you've just been introduced to, rather than the man who had tried to break you in front of your peers. As I walked away, the low murmur of voices swelled behind me. People were already piecing together what they'd just heard, connecting rumors with reality. I could feel the shift in the air, the subtle way people turned toward me instead of away. Richard might not have realized it yet, but the The balance of this company had just tilted, and it wasn't in his favor. That moment, sharp and glittering like the city lights outside, would become the start of a story that reached far beyond one humiliating scene at a holiday party. But standing there, the taste of victory and champagne still on my lips, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about surviving Richard's attacks anymore. It was about changing the game entirely. When I first joined the company, I believed hard work spoke for itself. I was 31, fresh off a master's program, and convinced that competence would be rewarded. Richard became my direct supervisor within 6 months, and at first I thought his confidence was a sign of a strong leader. The first time he presented my campaign concept as his own, I brushed it off as a misunderstanding. The second time, when he gave a client pitch using the copy I had spent nights perfecting, I told myself I must have failed to make my contributions clear. By the third, I stopped making excuses for him. It wasn't just me. I watched the same thing happen to other women on our team. Brilliant, inventive strategies conceived in brainstorming sessions would resurface in Richard's presentations with not a single mention of the people who had created them. During all-hands meetings, he would stride to the front with a smile, clicking through slides that represented weeks of our effort, speaking about them as if they had come to him in a stroke of genius. The applause always went to him, and every time I felt a quiet tightening in my chest. The impact on the team was subtle at first. A few missed brainstorming sessions here, less enthusiasm in meetings there. But after a year, I could see it clearly. Women who had once stayed late perfecting a pitch began leaving right at 5. Ideas came slower, shared in half-hearted tones. Even the best minds on the team had learned that no matter how much they gave, the credit would land somewhere else. The energy that had made our department special was fading. I kept my head down. I told myself I could outlast it, that if I worked harder and made myself indispensable, eventually, someone would notice. But as the months passed, I realized no one was keeping track. Our wins were Richard's wins, and our losses were pinned on those lower down the ladder. It was a cycle I'd seen before in other offices, but this time, it was eating away at people I cared about. 2 years in, I decided I couldn't rely on memory or office gossip to prove what was happening. I began keeping records quietly at first. I opened a spreadsheet on my personal drive, color-coded by project. I noted the originator of every idea, tracked the resources allocated, and compared outcomes against the credit received. It wasn't about revenge, not then. It was about making sense of the fog we were all operating in. The patterns emerged quickly. Projects led by women consistently outperformed others, averaging 34% higher engagement and return. These same projects received fewer resources and almost never resulted in public recognition for the real creators. The numbers were undeniable. What stung most was seeing the hard proof of what I'd suspected all along. Our department's strongest work was being stripped of its ownership before it ever saw the light of day. I didn't know what I would do with the information. I kept adding to it week after week like a secret journal. Sometimes I'd scroll through the rows late at night, a mix of anger and validation swirling in me. It wasn't just in my head. We were being systematically erased from our own successes. That knowledge made it harder to stay quiet. The moment that changed everything came on a Wednesday afternoon. The board was touring the building, shaking hands and nodding through carefully staged project updates. Marilyn Brooks, one of the board members, stopped by my desk. She was impeccably dressed, her gaze sharp but curious. She asked what I was working on, her tone casual. Instinctively, I minimized the spreadsheet and said it was just some personal analysis. She tilted her head slightly, studying me in a way that made my pulse quicken. "That doesn't look like personal analysis," she said. "It looks like business intelligence, something we might want to review at the board level." Her voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it, the kind that comes from years of navigating power quietly. For a second, I considered brushing her off. I didn't know her, and the risk of showing her my work felt enormous. But there was something in her expression, a spark of recognition, as if she'd seen this kind of thing before and wasn't surprised. I heard myself asking if she had time for coffee sometime. I had something I thought the board should see. 2 days later, we met at a cafe 3 blocks from the office. I brought my laptop, hands sweating as I opened the file. Marilyn didn't interrupt as I walked her through the charts and summaries. Her expression stayed neutral until I finished. Then she closed the laptop gently and said the board had been concerned about why so many women were leaving the company. Now she told me she understood. She didn't promise immediate change. She told me to keep documenting, to keep excelling, and not to tell anyone we'd spoken. Her words were steady, but I could feel the undertone of something larger. In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone in seeing what was wrong. And that small recognition from someone with the power to act was enough to turn my quiet frustration into resolve. From then on, I recorded everything with a purpose. Not just dates and names, but the subtleties of how ideas moved. Who was in the room when credit shifted the emails that quietly omitted key contributors? Each entry felt like placing another brick in a wall I might someday need to stand on. I didn't know when or how the opportunity would come, but I was preparing for it. Looking back, those 3 years under Richard's shadow hardened something in me. The bitterness was still there, but so was a clear-eyed determination. I stopped waiting for someone to notice and started building the case myself. By the time the holiday party rolled around, I was ready in ways Richard could never have imagined. The groundwork for my moment had been laid long before I ever stood in that glittering ballroom with a champagne glass in my hand. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, its subject line short and vague, confidential meeting with the board. My stomach tightened as I read it, convinced this was the end. In my experience, board meetings with employees like me rarely meant good news. I spent the rest of the day distracted, running through every possible misstep I might have made, every piece of data I had collected, and wondering if someone had found a way to turn it against me. 2 days later, I walked into the boardroom 15 minutes early, hoping the extra time would steady my nerves. The space felt too large, the polished table stretching farther than seemed necessary. I sat at one end, my hands folded in front of me, watching the sunlight slide across the floor. When the door finally opened, it wasn't 1 or 2 people, but the entire board entering at once. The chairperson took a seat across from me and began speaking in a tone that was calm, but impossible to read. They had reviewed my analysis alongside the company's performance metrics. The words washed over me until one sentence landed like a stone in my chest. "We'd like to offer you the position of Director of Marketing." For a second, I just stared, certain I had misheard. My first thought was that there had been a mistake. Richard had more than a decade of senior experience. But then the chairperson leaned forward and said, "Experience isn't measured in years. It's measured in results, and my results have been carrying this department for years without recognition." I left that meeting in a daze, the official letter tucked into my bag. On the elevator ride down, I knew I wasn't going to tell anyone right away. The promotion was more than a change in title. It was a shift in the balance of power, and I needed time to think about what came next. I spent the next day mapping out ideas in a notebook, outlining a plan to restructure the department, introduce transparency policies, and ensure that credit followed the work to its true source. Keeping the news to myself felt strange, like walking around with a secret that hummed just under my skin. I avoided Richard as much as possible, answering his emails with polite efficiency and giving no hint of what I now knew. My plan was to announce it formally with the board's support after the new year. But life has a way of rewriting plans at the worst possible moments. The holiday party forced my hand. Richard's public tirade left no graceful way to stay silent. I could have pulled him aside, told him in private, but the sheer gall of his attack in front of our colleagues made that option impossible. In the heat of the moment, the words had simply come out, and with them, the room shifted. After the party, I caught sight of Richard across the lobby. He was still processing, his face tight. his eyes scanning for someone to back him up. When our eyes met, I saw not just anger, but calculation. He was already thinking about how to undermine me, how to test whether I could handle the role I had been given. I knew then that the fight ahead would be about more than leading a department. It would be about dismantling the system he had built to keep himself on top. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open. I wrote the words, "Department Restructure," across the top of a fresh page. Beneath it, I listed the principles that would guide everything from that point forward. Transparency in idea attribution, equal resource allocation, and leadership by merit instead of politics. It wasn't just about defending my new position. It was about creating a department where no one would ever have to go through what I had endured. By the time I closed the notebook, I knew exactly where to begin. Richard didn't waste time after the holiday party. Within days, small disruptions started appearing in my schedule. Meeting invites I had set up would vanish from my calendar, replaced by conflicts that kept me from important discussions. Documents I needed for client calls would go missing from the shared drive, only to reappear hours later, too late to prepare. At first, I felt a flash of frustration each time, but I had expected this. Before accepting the promotion, I had quietly built safeguards. Every file had a triple backup. Every key conversation was logged through an alternate communication channel, and I had a direct line to each team member so no one could be cut out of the loop without me knowing. It was almost satisfying to see him run into walls he didn't even know I had built. When he tried to corner me into making rushed decisions in front of others, I countered with calm, documented facts. When he sent me urgent emails at 3 a.m, I let them sit until normal business hours, refusing to play into his manufactured emergencies. My focus was on the team. I began assigning projects so the original creators could present directly to clients. The difference was immediate. People who had been silent in meetings started speaking up again, their voices steady and sure. The real test came with the Harrington Global account. They were our largest client, and the renewal contract was worth millions. I had assigned a diverse team, including several employees Richard had sidelined in the past, to develop the expansion strategy. They poured themselves into it, working late, cross-referencing market data, and building a proposal that was both bold and airtight. The night before the meeting, I left the completed presentation in a labeled folder on my desk, planning to review it one last time in the morning. When I arrived early the next day, the folder was gone. My stomach dropped. I checked the building security logs. Only one person had entered our floor between the cleaners leaving at midnight and my arrival, Richard, who had badged in at 5:43 a.m. and left half an hour later. At 8:30, an email from him landed in my inbox. He wrote that he had taken the initiative to lead the Harrington presentation himself, moving it to a restaurant across town because of his long-standing relationship with the client. The meeting was set for 9. I grabbed my phone and called Marilyn. She picked up on the first ring, her voice calm but alert. I told her what happened. She asked for the address, and when I hesitated, she said she would handle it. I didn't know what that meant, but I trusted her enough to send it. Then I pulled every backup file I had and printed the proposal on the spot. My heart was hammering as I caught a cab to the restaurant. Through the window, I saw Richard already seated with the Harrington team gesturing like the master storyteller he fancied himself to be. Before I could step inside, a sleek black car pulled up. Marilyn stepped out flanked by another board member and, to my surprise, Eleanor Harrington herself. She was the founder and CEO of the client company, a woman with a reputation for sharp instincts and a low tolerance for corporate games. Marilyn greeted me and explained she and Eleanor had been having breakfast when my text came through. Eleanor had been intrigued by our new transparency initiative. We walked into the restaurant together. Richard's smile faltered when he saw Eleanor, and it vanished completely when she told him the schedule her office received listed me and my team as the presenters. He tried to recover, saying it was a last-minute change for the client's benefit. Eleanor didn't bite. She suggested we proceed as planned. I took a breath and said the presentation was developed by my team, naming each person who contributed. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, clearly approving of the acknowledgement. I set up my materials and began. As I spoke, I made sure to attribute every section to its creator. When I described a particularly innovative approach to the Asia-Pacific market, I credited Lucia, who was watching from the office via video call. Eleanor asked to speak with the team directly, and within minutes they were on screen, answering questions with the confidence of people who knew their work inside out. Richard sat back silent. When Eleanor's executives pressed for details, he had nothing to add. He didn't understand the strategy well enough to fake it. By the time the meeting ended, the Harrington team was smiling, already discussing next steps. Eleanor walked me to the door, telling me she wanted to see the data analysis I had done on idea attribution. Then she handed me her card with her personal number on the back. As we left the restaurant, I glanced back to see Richard alone at the table, his posture stiff. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The victory wasn't just that the presentation had gone forward as intended. It was that my team had been seen, heard, and credited in a way that couldn't be undone. That more than anything was the win I had been working toward. The weeks after the Harrington presentation felt different. There was an energy in the department I hadn't seen in years. People spoke up without hesitation, pitched bold ideas, and stayed engaged because they knew their contributions would be recognized. Clients noticed too. Harrington insisted on keeping the original creators involved through implementation, and other accounts began asking for the same. What started as an internal policy became a competitive advantage. For Richard, the shift was less inspiring. The transparency framework left no room for the sleight of hand he had relied on. Every idea had a documented origin. Every credit line was public. In 3 months, he had not produced a single original contribution that could be measured. Without the ability to claim others' work, he was simply quiet. The meetings where he once dominated the conversation now passed, with him adding little more than vague commentary. I could have pushed to remove him and the board would have backed me. But firing him outright felt too simple, too much like the kind of personal grudge he would spin into a martyr's story. I wanted something that left no doubt about the truth. So I created a new position, Attribution Compliance Specialist. The role's purpose was to ensure every project properly credited its contributors, monitor for any signs of misappropriation, and enforce the very rules that had exposed him. It was the definition of poetic justice. When I called him into my office to discuss the reassignment, he recognized it immediately. He accused me of trying to force him out. I told him the board considered the role critical to our future. His office salary and title as associate director would remain, but his responsibilities would be solely about safeguarding the system he had once exploited. His expression shifted between disbelief and anger, as if he couldn't decide which would serve him better. He said it was revenge. I told him it was transparency. He said he could sue for harassment. I reminded him that discovery works both ways, and there were years of emails, meeting notes, and project records that would become public. For a long moment, he just stared at me. Then he stood without a word and walked out. The next morning, his office sat empty. I thought he was taking a day to regroup, but just before lunch, he appeared with a box of personal items. Moving on, he said without meeting my eyes. A week later, I learned he had taken a position at a tiny startup with 3 employees. It was a step down so steep it felt like a different world. I didn't celebrate. The point had never been to destroy him. It was to make sure someone like him couldn't thrive in the environment we had built. Watching him leave with his box, I realized I had done exactly that. The system was stronger than any single person, including me, and that was the real win. A few months after Richard left, I opened my inbox to find an email with the subject line, "Thank you." It was from Naomi, his ex-wife. She wrote that she didn't know if I remembered her from the holiday party, but watching what I had done at the company had made her look at her own marriage in a new light. She realized she had been allowing Richard to take credit for her contributions in their personal life, just as he had in his professional one. The day after he started his new job, she filed for divorce. Now she had launched her own interior design business, and for the first time in 15 years, her name stood alone on her work. I read it twice before closing my laptop. The changes I had fought for were never just about me, but seeing proof that they had rippled into someone else's life hit differently. It reminded me that leadership isn't only about policies or performance metrics. Sometimes it's about showing people what's possible when you stop tolerating the unacceptable. Not long after the board invited me to speak at a leadership conference focused on women in business, I spent weeks crafting a talk about transparency as a driver of innovation, weaving in the lessons from the last year. On the night of the event, I stood in front of a room full of professionals, sharing how crediting the right people had transformed not just our results, but our culture. When I stepped off the stage, Marilyn was waiting with an envelope. Inside was a letter confirming my promotion to Senior Vice President of Creative Strategy. The board wanted the transparency framework implemented company-wide, and they wanted me to lead it. A year after that first holiday party, I found myself standing in the same ballroom, the air warm with music and laughter. This time, there was no tension in the room, no undercurrent of fear. I raised my glass, looking around at the people who had built this with me. To transparency, I said, and the words came back in unison from every corner. In that moment, I knew the culture had shifted for good. We had created a place where the right kind of people could thrive, and the wrong kind couldn't survive.